Today I'm exploring a brand new series based on the popular TV show Mythbusters. And I'll start by looking at badminton grip powder. I'm curious to see if there is a difference between grip powder at different price points and from different brands, and whether it actually makes a difference in the first place for someone like me, your typical intermediate badminton player. Now, if you're not familiar with grip powder, it's basically powder that you apply onto your towel grip, onto your racket just before you get on court, and it's meant to combat sweaty palms and basically absorb the sweat. Before starting this experiment, I was curious to see if it would actually make a difference because I've seen all the pro players in TV use it on court. I was also skeptical of whether there would really be a big difference between the different price points and brands, because it seems like it's just chalk grinded up into powder, and I've noticed it being used in other sports too, like climbing. But if you, like me, thought that the answer is obvious, you're in for a surprise. I'm Aske from Beast Badminton, and let's dig into the experiment. For this experiment, I'm looking at products from 4 different brands. We have the Yonex Grip Powder 2. We have the grip powder from Victor. We have the Leanings grip powder. And finally, we have a budget option, which is represented by V&B Sports here in Vietnam. There are a bunch of other brands out there like FZ Forza from Denmark and a bunch of budget options. But since we're looking at the grip powders relatively to each other, I think these brands will do just fine for this experiment. Next, let's move on to the myths we need to look at today. Before we jump into the experiment, let's look at expectations and the specific myths we're looking to bust today. So first of all, does the grip powder make a difference for us intermediate players or not? Second, is there a difference between each of the brands and the grip powder? Does it perform the same in terms of fighting sweat? And is the budget option worse or about the same or better at absorbing sweat? And finally, why is there a price difference between the top 3 brands, Leaning, Yonex and Victor? And mind you, I looked at the pricing across several stores in several countries, and of course the price wasn't exactly the same, but there was definitely a difference in terms of the pricing relative to the other products across countries and stores, where you would typically see, of course, there's the budget option being much cheaper than the others. Then the Victor option fell somewhere in the middle, and the Yonex was on the higher end along with the Leaning, while the Leaning option was that bit more expensive. But the Yonex and Leaning option was roughly in the same sort of price range. Now, the way I performed this experiment is simple. I used 2 types of towel grip, thinner and thicker, which, as far as I understand, typically goes between 50% or 100% cotton. I tested no grip powder versus grip powder. I tested each of the 4 products one after the other. So one game with the first product, the second game with the second product, and so on, to keep things consistent. And I would sometimes switch it up as well, just to make sure that I had less of an expectation before going on court. And I did this across 5 times 2 hours to give some room for changes in terms of changing the grip and different days, good versus bad days. Next, it's time for the results. The results are in. Let's look at the first myth. Does grip powder actually make a difference for us intermediate players with sweaty palms? It doesn't make a crazy difference, but say 10-20%, and it just takes the edge off, especially when you're midway or towards the end of a session where you're sweating a lot. I found that it just gives that bit extra dryness. And I play somewhere super humid and super hot, and I sweat quite a bit. I usually go through a couple of t-shirts on a 2-hour session. So this is a myth confirmed. Next, let's move on to the second myth and see if there's really a difference between the premium products and whether the budget option absorbs sweat as well as those more expensive ones, or if it's about the same. If we start with the budget option, I found that it absorbs sweat and feels just about the same as the more premium options. So myth busted. But if we compare the premium options among each other, I found that there was little difference in terms of the feel and the sweat absorption as well. But I noticed something else that made a huge difference. More on that in a second. Now, the last thing for us to understand is why there was a real price difference between the top tier brands. If you recall, Li-Ning was the most expensive one, then Yonex just slightly more affordable, and then finally we have the Victor option, which came in somewhere in the middle between the budget option and the Yonex and Li-Ning options. Now, the real difference, and this had more of an impact than I had expected, was the size of the cap, the hole, and how thinly the powder was grinded. Especially on the budget option, it was super hard to get the powder through the hole and onto the grip of the racket. Especially if you're playing open mats where you have to be a bit aware of when there's a free court and it's your turn and you don't have that much time to put the powder on if you also want to have a slot on the court. I found that the budget option basically went everywhere, especially if you play somewhere where there's a fan that can blow it a little bit. I found that it basically went on the floor, on my shorts, everywhere else than where I wanted it. I found myself often fighting to get it out, and I'm so frustrated by it that I often just wanted to pick any of the other options if it wasn't because I was doing this experiment. Now, if we look at the other end of the scale, with Li-Ning being the most expensive option, followed by Yonex, it was the opposite experience as well. It was super easy to get out and onto the racket instead of everywhere else, and I found that I wasted a lot less of it by it not going everywhere else. Interestingly, the Victor option came in somewhere in the middle, and I found myself more frustrated than I had expected, having a similar problem as I had with the budget option, but though not as bad. So in terms of pricing, where this one comes in right in the middle, the performance, so to speak, of getting it out of the bottle and onto the correct place without wasting it was also somewhere in the middle. It wasn't as annoying as the budget option, but at times where I allowed myself to just pick whichever one I wanted, I found myself going for the Li-Ning and Yonex options all the time, just because it was so irritating to get it out and fight with the bottle. Let's finish this experiment with a few takeaways. So first of all, I guess the question is, will I be using it again? And yes, I will. Probably not in the first game when I get on court, but as the sessions progress, it becomes more and more handy for someone like me who sweats quite a bit. And if you're on the sweatier side of the middle as a player, you'll probably appreciate using it as well, provided you're playing with a towel grip. Now, for me, the premium options, Yonex and Li-Ning, was absolutely worth the extra money. For me, the budget option will go right in the trash bin. It's just too annoying to use. Now, of course, that makes me wonder, why is there such a difference between the Yonex Li-Ning option and the two other ones, if it's just really chalk grinded up into powder? So I had a quick look at the ingredients in each bottle, and I found that on the budget option, it's magnesium carbonate, and on the Victor option, it's magnesium carbonate and calcium carbonate, and on the leaning option, it's those two along with pine raisin and zeolite. And the Yonex bottle is in Japanese, so I'll show you on the screen when I've translated it into English, but you'll see that there's extra products like egg or eggshells, I believe, and zeolite as well. So there's a couple more ingredients, so to speak, within these two better grip powder products, and I'm thinking that that must be the difference, since everything else kind of seems the same. I'm Aske from Beast Badminton, and if you want more experiments like this one, leave a comment below. I'll see you on court.